Hello everybody. Thank you for joining me today for our 9th edition Demons leaks. It's pretty exciting stuff. It's actually kind of on the fence about sharing any leaked information about the book prior to its release. I know a lot of content creators are out there and they have either signed NDAs or have relationships in the industry that make it so they're not able to talk about book leaks before they are officially released. And out of respect for that, I didn't want to, treat any other content creators unfairly. I'm not personally under any kind of NDA, so whenever I encounter information, I'm freely able to share it. So with that consideration, I wasn't initially going to do any kind of video about what's in our upcoming 9th/10th edition Chaos Demons Codex. But my main reason for changing my mind was mostly due to a lot of the comments I've been seeing from the various groups I'm a part of for the Chaos Demons community, which seem to have been very disappointed recently, mostly due to the lack of any update at all about the timeline of the book release or about anything going on with our current codex, our current faction. Nothing was changed in the most recent balanced data slate. Our points haven't been updated in the field manual, so a lot of people had the perception that we're a faction that GW forgot about or doesn't like. And it just seems really discouraging. And what changed my mind in particular was just hearing a lot of players make statements like they were thinking about selling their demon collection or moving to a different faction. Just mostly due to the lack of communication or the discouragement. And I wanted to step in and say, well, first of all, we don't have to wait too long for the next book. It sounds like it should be out by the end of the year. It's likely going to come before the Christmas release. If I were to guess, it would be October. And second, that the book that we have coming has a lot of attention put into it, a lot of good design choices, and a lot of thought that I think will make it a very fun and rewarding book for longtime Chaos Demons fans and collectors. So hopefully this gives us something to be excited about and look forward to as we survive the next couple of months in a uncaring 9th edition meta. And without any further ado, I guess it's only last thing left to say is the boys are back in town.
Guess who just got back today? Them wild-eyed boys that had been away. They were asking if you were around. I told them you were living. They were asking if you could be found. I told them no. The boys are back in town. Boys are back in town to kill you. Every night their boys sing, won't be long till you will be on the floor shaking.
So before we talk about where we're going, we should talk a little bit about where we are right now, because it's important to highlight kind of the design philosophy of the current codex, because it'll help us establish kind of the way that things will be changing. And when I thought about demons, I thought about them in the competitive sense, mostly because on a narrative side of things, it's harder to establish what works and what doesn't. So in a competitive environment, demons have seen generally two list archetypes. There's these monster mash builds that usually rely either on the Keeper of Secrets or, several exalted reward buffed various greater demons. And then there's the Disciples of Be'lakor lists. And those two make up kind of the current dynamic of the book. So in the current dynamic of the book, you either want a lot of big monsters that are fast and can do scary combat things, or you want to play Disciples of Be'lakor, which is much more of a horde army. It's an army where you're bringing tons of models to the table, you're utilizing splitting horrors and all other kinds of neat tricks in order to kind of flood the board and be very difficult to deal with. So the first largest change between the current iteration of the Daemons Codex and our 9th edition version is that greater demons have been limited to 1 per detachment. So you won't be seeing any 3 Keepers of Secrets plus Shalaxi type lists in the new book. On top of that, all the greater demons have had their wound characteristics absolutely jacked up. Many of them will now be waddling around with a wound characteristic that is more similar to like a knight's. And because of this change, the greater demons have become more powerful, more elite, and more expensive to put on the table. And they're much more of a centerpiece model to your army that you probably are only going to have 1 or 2 of, if you have any at all. They are still quite good, but they're going to be targets for your opponent's shooting since they can't hide behind obscuring, at least as far as we know with 9th edition rules. The next thing that's changed, that's a major change, is a lot of the horde-style armies are going to be more MSU now. So they're going to be a lot smaller in general because many unit sizes have been decreased. So typically, the troops have been reduced to a 10 troop maximum, like a 10 model in the unit maximum. So horrors, plague bearers, and bloodletters all have to abide by that restriction. Demonettes have been reduced to 20 as their unit size cap. With this change, everything has gotten more elite to compensate for it, so most things are more survivable. Most of the aura abilities have been changed into command abilities, which is a very welcome change from the current iteration of the book. No more heralds with 6-inch +1 strength bonuses. It's going to be all about the command phase activations that they give you. And one of the last changes I want to go over is that most units now can deep strike completely for free. This is a really nice change, as with how CP hungry the current mission pack is, you're going to be wanting to put a lot of things in reserve and not have to pay for it. And that's one of the nicer changes. And then as a change that is possibly the most impactful or redefining for the book, demons now have a completely new kind of save. So everyone that joked that, with all of the ignores invuln in the game now, demons are going to need a super invuln save. Well, that's more or less what happened. We were given a new save that's kind of like a Ideneth Deepkin save for those familiar with Age of Sigmar. It's an unrendable armor save, essentially, that will replace our invulns. And the next thing about this that's really interesting is the book actually separates out their save as being different depending on the kind of attack that's targeting us. So shooting attacks are going to have different saves than melee attacks. So that way our pseudo-invuln or our super invuln kind of changes based on what's targeting us. And as an example of that, consider like a Lord of Change. Let's say you have a Lord of Change with 20 wounds. He's toughness 8. He's -1 to wound with ranged shooting, and he has a 3-up unrendable armor save against ranged shooting attacks. But if you get him into melee, that's reduced to a 5-up save against melee attacks. So it is interesting because it provides us with usually better protection against shooting attacks than melee attacks. But you're not going to see any of these saves be worse than, at minimum, that 5+. On the note of Zitch, why don't we take a look at the Zitch changes? So the first one I want to point out that I thought was interesting is that horrors now split for free on a 5+ when they die. You don't set up aside points before the game and split as they go, which I think is a very welcome change for a lot of people, myself included, since that's a lot less bookkeeping to do while you're actually playing the game. And I think it's a really eloquent way to balance that unit, as they've been kind of grappling with how to represent the splitting mechanic since the Silver Tower box set's release that gave us the Blues and Brimstone models to begin with. Another change is that Treason of Zitch now turns off auras. It doesn't take control of a character with a really swingy leadership check. And this is a really nice change as well, as there's a lot of auras still floating around in the game that you might want to, situationally shut down. And I believe the effects of it last until your next psychic phase, so it's a long time for them to go without their buff character passing around the stuff. This one is crazy to me. I figured Infernal Gateway was going to receive some kind of a nerf or get readjusted or removed with this new book, as it was always kind of this clunky, very powerful, over-the-top spell that your Lord of Change would throw out. But they went the other direction with it, and they actually buffed Infernal Gateway. It's almost exactly the same as it is now, with two key differences. One is when it goes big mode and you roll high on your casting results, so it does bonus damage. It just does flat 3. It doesn't do d6, which I believe is what it did before. But the other change, which is the really good thing, is that the unit that you target with the spell, the AoE from the spell's explosion effect, which is this, it was previously that 3-inch bubble around the nearest model in the nearest unit. It now just says that it hits the unit you target, and then all units within 3 inches of that unit, which is obviously quite a bit more powerful, especially if you are using this spell on their screens. So if you hit like a unit screening for their army, and that that unit stretches around their deployment, you're going to be able to draw that 3 inches from any model in that unit, and possibly get some really nice angles and snipe a bunch of stuff. So that's the idea, at least. It is quite a bit more powerful and harder to position around now, which is a very cool and powerful effect. So I was surprised to hear that had actually gotten buffed. I think there's a lot of interesting ways to use it now that didn't exist before. The next thing I wanted to mention is Karius, the Fate Weaver, our very special named Lord of Change, has gotten a much-needed glow-up in this book. Karius is just a lot scarier in general, has a lot more powerful utility rules. But one of the rules that I think is just astounding is that Karius gets plus X to their cast, where X is equal to the game's current battle round. So as the battle continues on, this ritual keeps growing, and the arcane energy empowers Kairos' abilities. And that's very interesting and very cool. And there's a lot of scenarios I could see where I might want this character in my army, and maybe even hold it back if I can deep strike it in a later turn when my buffs are a little bit more online, to go for some really devastating sorcery out of deep strike. And then the last change that's not really a change, it's actually just something that stayed. It's just that the Lord of Changes did get to keep their +2 to cast, because I was curious about that with how Karius's ability did change. Following along with the god numbers and going down sequentially, we get to Khorne. Khorne is one of my personal favorites, so I was very happy to find that Khorne got quite a bit of love in the new book. So first and foremost, bloodletters are just insanely murdery now. A lot of the things that we had to really work to get in their current form, they just have now. So for instance, they just have base 2 attacks now. They just have strength 5. They just have AP -3. And their weapons are always damage 2, not just when you roll 6s. And this is all before you do things to roid them up and make them even more threatening. So, for instance, you can make their 6s to hit auto wound, you can give them almost full rerolls, and you can give them bonus attacks. And honestly, this is one of the units that really did need that 10 model restriction, because hitting somebody with 20 bloodletters now, with their new profile with just a few buffs on them, would be unbelievably devastating. Like, you'd be able to destroy easily an Imperial Knight, in like its friends, with one activation. So that was, I think, part of why the limitations were put there. There's also a new name for what I believe will be the Blood Throne. It's called the Rendmaster. It's possible this is an entirely new model, but its stats lead me to believe that the Rendmaster is just a fancy new name for the Blood Throne. But it does look very intimidating, and it has a lot of the rules that we have to spend CP for now just baked into its stat sheet. So, for instance, it's got that lovely -1 damage, and it is a 9 wound character model. So that's going to be a cool thing to push around the table. Another cool thing is the Bloodthirster itself. So I think GW actually wants us to bring the Bloodthirsters, which is great, because they're very tanky now, and they get 8 brutal attacks at AP 4, and the damage, I believe, is 3 plus D3 on the heavy swing. So with 8 attacks, that's a lot of damage, and it is a sweep profile as well, which is damage 1 but AP 3. So you can send the Bloodthirster in just about anything now: Armor of Contempt, heavy armor, horde, and it'll rip and tear its way through properly. The last thing I'm going to mention is, in general, all of Khorne's units got +1 toughness, essentially. A lot of them also have a 4+ unrendable save against shooting. Blood Crushers notably love that, especially on top of the fact that now Blood Crushers have 5 wounds on their profile. So they're going to be a lot harder to clean up, and you can actually, as Khorne, put models on the table, not just in Deep Strike, and expect those models to be there the following turn, which is a very nice change, as for a while we've really suffered from the inability to play the shooting game against other armies. All right, and now we move to Nurgle. So Nurgle has had a pretty nice fundamental rework on most of their data sheets. And the big thing that I'm going to address right away is that Plague Bearers are now toughness 5 with 2 wounds. So that's a pretty reasonable stat line right there. That's a pretty tanky boy. Well, on top of that, they gained the new version of Disgusting Resilience, which has replaced all other instances of Disgusting Resilience in the book. So there's not going to be that 5+ Feel No Pain, but you are going to have -1 damage. So there's situations where that's going to be better and situations where that's going to be worse. Overall, it should be better, and there are other defensive layers you can put on your units to really make that feel cranked. Another interesting change is that Nurglings are no longer troops. They still get their forward deploy, thankfully, but they are going to be something that you bring, I believe, in either the fast attack or the elite slot. So Nurglings are no longer going to be, free OBSEC as well. The next thing that I wanted to bring up is, do you remember in 7th edition when we had the Touch of Rust ability and we could reasonably glance vehicles to death on 6s with our Plague Bearers? Well, that's kind of coming back. And what I mean by that is all of our units are getting better at wounding things, and Plague Swords have actual AP now. So if you have a 10-man unit of Plague Bearers and you put enough command abilities on them, they can take out light or medium armor vehicles pretty decently, which I thought was pretty interesting. So you might see some lists running around where people are bringing just a ton of Plague Bearers and then characters buffing them up and like sending them in to go do some damage to some power armored bodies, which is not something they could do before. So we've got a pseudo Touch of Rust back, and that feels nice. Having actual AP on our weapons feels nice. The last thing I wanted to mention as just a quick aside is that beasts are very interesting now, as their stat profile got significantly harder to shift. You can still bring them in multi-model units as well, but they're capped out at 3 now instead of at 9. So don't worry, if you haven't already, you're not going to need to shell out, the $1,000 or whatever to get 3 units of 9, as that's a very expensive model kit. But Nurgle changes are pretty widespread, and almost everything got at least 1 wound added to their profile to compensate for the changes and feel no pains. So that's very nice. And also most things have gotten a lot more deadly as well. So hopefully our drones and Plague Bearers won't just be bouncing off of rhinos and whatnot. So moving on to Slanesh. This is definitely a god I'm going to probably talk about a little bit less than the others. Not because there weren't changes with Slanesh, but rather because the changes that Slanesh had really just accentuate what they already wanted to do. Whereas I feel like Nurgle got pretty much overhauled in a lot of ways. So, for instance, with Slanesh, you now have access to all kinds of fight tricks. You have access to Fight on Death, Fights Last, and Fights First. And so you can really manipulate the activation phase for your models, which feels pretty nice. Chariots are toughness 6 now, which I thought was a kind of fun change. I can actually see myself bringing some of these new chariots because they're quite a bit more deadly as well. And they're fast enough that they can somewhat get around the movement restrictions that ruins have. The next thing is that Demonettes have been greatly improved in terms of their offensive output. They had a lot of attacks before, but they didn't have enough buffs you could put on top of that to really make that scary. Like you'd have to get all 30 Demonettes to swing at one thing for you to really start to feel like the volume was adding up. So now, you can still get those auto-wounding 6s, but you can also get full rerolls on your Demonettes if you layer the correct buffs on them. And that's just fantastic. Just a bunch of attacks with high rend, and you can drown most enemy units in it, which is pretty nice. The last change for Slanesh I wanted to mention was just that the Epitome and the Mask are greatly changed. They serve very different battlefield roles than they did before. So the Mask is no longer just utility, somewhat buff my Demonette's character. The Mask actually gets to run around and provide really interesting buffs or debuffs depending on the dance that you're doing. And the Epitome, it's more spell oriented. It's not going to be about the no fallback aura anymore on that model. It's going to be a lot more focused on its utilities that it provides for the rest of your demons. So I thought those were two interesting changes, and I'm really excited to see good Slanesh players get in there and try mixing it up with some of their new combat tricks. So that covers just about everything. There are two changes I wanted to save towards the end, just because they're a little bit of a disappointment. The first change is that Furies will no longer be in the Chaos Demons Codex. They're getting straight up removed. And if you're like me and just had 20 Furies commission painted, you're probably going to feel pretty bad about that. But luckily, they still have rules in Age of Sigmar, so I'm going to shift mine over there. But that is a unit that unfortunately will not be making a return in this book as far as their current rules are. Maybe it's something that gets added in the future, who knows. But they'll be out of the original or the initial Codex release. The other change is that summoning is not going to be in the book, or at least there's not summoning as we think of it today. So no setting aside points before the game. It sounds like summoning is rather going to be changed into kind of like a homing beacon effect for units that are already in your list, that you can have them jump in closer than 9 inches if it's around a character. So that's what I have heard about one of the changes to summoning. There's also a unique new faction ability that works somewhat similar to the warp tides that we had in 7th edition. So the warp is it's like a combination between that and warp charge points from when we used to have to generate warp charge points during our psychic phases. And essentially it's a new point system that'll allow us to do some cool stuff. And I'm not sure if free units is included on that table, just because I've heard from different sources different things. So it sounds like there's a potential that there's still an ability to summon new units to the table, particularly like cheap units, like troop units, using that faction rule, but that's unclear. On the note of Bellacor's big role in this codex is that there's going to be the faction mechanic I just mentioned. It gets stronger if you're a monogod faction and weaker for each god you add to your list. Bellacor undoes that. So if you have Bellacor in your army, he's going to allow you to mix and match as you please without giving up the really cool bonuses that the Warp Storm or Ruin Storm table gives you. So that's the last kind of thing that we're going to have in there. And I wanted to mention that in addition to they're taking out summoning, but we're getting something in exchange for it. But if you're like me and you liked summoning, that kind of does feel bad. But that's about everything. I hope that you're as excited as I am. I think there's a lot of really cool stuff in here. I know there's a lot of changes, and it's a lot of change all at once, but once we actually get more of these leaks or more of the book starts to come out, or when we actually get it in our hands, I think we'll be really excited with what we see, because a lot of these changes, I think, are in general for the better or have a very good design purpose for them. So it's pretty exciting that I think it's like only just a few months away where we'll start getting some of those official rules releases and those Warhammer community articles. So holding out for that, and thank you all for stopping by.